I want to talk about three images in the House of the Seven Gables, and each of these three images has to do with transparency and opacity. What do I mean by that? I'm going to talk about the mirror. A mirror, of course, is a piece of glass, but it's been made opaque. You cannot see through the mirror. When you look at the mirror, it is pure reflection. And certainly the opacity is what causes the reflection. Bubbles. Clifford blows bubbles from the arched window, and the windows fall down, the people passing by. People can see reflected in the bubble the world outside of them. They can see entire worlds. Bubbles are, of course, both opaque and transparent at the same time. You can look at a bubble and you can see through it to the other side, like you could a window. But also, you look at a bubble and it will refract light too, and that refraction will, of course, it will reflect light. Sorry, it will reflect light as well, and you can see your image in the bubbles. This is why Hawthorne's narrator calls the bubbles little tiny worlds that come into being and disappear. And this is suitable to Clifford, someone who lacks a sense of continuity in his life, who lacks a sense of a constant identity, a sense of permanence. So his own life is just as flitting and fleeting as these bubbles. And in the passage, the narrator suggests that these bubbles themselves symbolize the transient quality of life. Then the third image is Maul's Well, a fountain in the garden, the pension garden at the House of the Seven Gables. At the bottom of the well, there are multicolored stones. You can see the water constantly playing over the multicolored stones. So as you look through the water, there's much more of a sense of transparency here than opacity. And what do you see at the bottom? Again, you see through to this kind of phantasmagoric. That's what the narrator uses, the word the narrator uses, phantasmagoric play of color. Now, Hawthorne, in his two great works of fiction, some might say had four great works, I would say his two great works, Scarlet Letter, House of Seven Gables, is very aware of using imagery in a deliberate way. But we have to be very careful in thinking about Hawthorne's use of imagery. In the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne describes a world in which the characters living in 17th century Puritan New England are very keen on allegorizing. In other words, if these characters see any given phenomenon, physical phenomenon, they're very likely to turn it into a sign of some theological meaning. They see nature, in other words, as a book of allegorical figures that point to invisible meanings, abstract meanings. And the problem in that novel comes when people will look at a given image, like the Scarlet Letter, and reduce it to one meaning and only one meaning. Whereas Hester Prynne takes the Scarlet Letter, an A, which is meant to stand for adultery, and what does she do? She changes it, she transforms it, she embroiders on it. And this sort of opens up new meanings for the letter A. So she frees the A from stiff allegory and makes it a living, transient symbol. It seems that the novel The Scarlet Letter is very attuned to what Emerson in The Poet calls the distinction between the mystic and the poet. And the mystic nails an image down to one meaning and one meaning only. This would be the allegorical way of looking at the world. And the poet sees an image as capable of signifying all sorts of meanings at the same time. And in this regard, Hester Prynne would be a poet. She's able to open up the A to many meanings at one time. So when we're reading Hawthorne and we see what he clearly means as an image that is significant for shedding light on the novel, like the mirror and the bubbles and Maul's Well, I think we have to be aware of being overly simplistic in our interpretation. If anything, in Hawthorne's novels and short stories, we see that characters who are overly simplistic in interpreting images, symbols, end poorly. They end poorly. They become stiff and sad and bitter, contemptuous. How is the image of the mirror functioning in this novel? Now, I'm going to offer a few ideas, but I'm not saying that my ideas are exhaustive at all. Part of the power of these images is their ambiguity. They inform the novel in many different ways from many different angles. The mirror used to hang in the Pynchon household, the House of the Seven Gables, along with the portrait of the Colonel. The portrait of the Colonel still stands. And the legend is that when members of the Pynchon family look into the mirror, they see not only their own image, but the image of all their ancestors, in particular their ancestors in states of suffering in some cases. So the mirror in this case, among other things, could symbolize a kind of narcissistic gaze, that to look at one's self is not to see oneself as the same, but an other. That's what a mirror really is, right? I look at myself and I am my body, and then there's that image of me in the mirror, which is not my body. So I can say looking in the mirror is narcissistic because I'm staring at my own image, but you can also see looking at the mirror as the opposite, as a sense that I am not unified, that I'm split, that I am this thing and that other thing at the same time. And that could open up the idea of myself as being multiple and full of possibility. But if I look at the mirror and I see my own family members only, if I see my own line, that's not only narcissistic personally because I'm very interested in my family, but also it's narcissistic generationally, as if I not simply want to see myself now, but I want to see my entire bloodline. So, of course, this is suitable for the House of the Seven Gables, which has that kind of static quality where people live there and constantly run the risk of repeating the ancestors that have come before. Sometimes wanting to do that, other times not wanting to do that, but doing it anyway. So we can say that the mirror is a glass-like structure, an interplay of opacity and transparency, here opacity solely, that seems to reinforce this kind of narcissism that ties in with wanting to repeat history. Narcissism as a certain mode of being that doesn't like change, because the narcissist wants everything to stay the same as long as his ego remains intact. And what better way to keep an ego intact, and indeed to keep an ego strong, than to see it as supported by history itself. I am a culmination of this historical line. I'm repeating this historical line in such a way that shows the validity of my ego. That is what the mirror suggests, and that is what the House of the Seven Gables itself suggests. So in this regard, the mirror seems to symbolize a certain quality of the House of the Seven Gables, this kind of narcissistic gaze on history. Now, what about the bubbles? The bubbles seem to suggest the opposite. So we have Clifford sitting, looking out of a window of the House of Seven Gables, not looking inward, looking outward at the promenade of people walking up and down the street and blowing these wispy bubbles onto them. And of course, they're little tiny worlds that hit people and they pop. So the bubbles suggest like a total, they're evanescent, they're transient. They're the opposite of tradition and history and genealogy. They in fact suggest that nothing lasts very long. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is stable. Things are always moving toward their extinction every second. So this is the opposite. And of course, it has to do with moving. If you move outside of the House of Seven Gables into the street, there's an indifference to tradition. There's an indifference to genealogy. There's motion. There are other people who care nothing for you. And this seems healthy compared to the narcissistic gaze on history that we see in the House of the Seven Gables. The problem, though, we might say with this is that, like Clifford, these bubbles suggest no sense of permanence. That how can you gain any sense of meaning and significance if there is only change? Isn't meaning repetition with a difference, or difference with a repetition? Isn't that the form of all knowledge? that, okay, spring comes every year, that's a repetition, but every year I'm a little bit different because I've developed, and that allows me to measure how I've grown, how I've changed, and allows me to know something about myself. But if there's mere change with no identity, if there's mere difference with no repetition, there's no way to gain any sense of knowledge or permanence, rhythm, stability. All qualities that probably most of us would agree that we need to have a healthy sense of self and be able to relate to others in a healthy way. What about Mall's well? This seems to bring the extremes together because we have permanence. We have the stones at the bottom. They're not going anywhere. They are going to repeat from minute to minute, from minute to minute. But the way the water moves over them constantly changes them. So there's an interplay here between permanence and change. Permanence and change. In this regard, we can see the Mall's well suggesting an identity somewhat like Holgrave's, whom we learn is constantly changing, constantly taking on new jobs, but yet retains a sense of identity through the change. Or we can say that the play of water over the rocks is like Phoebe as well, perhaps. Someone who, again, respects her past, but also has an eye to the future and is open to change. She moves from the country to the city, and she grows to love Hepzibah and Clifford. So she's someone who is able to bring together this stasis and this flux. Clifford is associated with the bubbles. He is someone who is in too much flux, lacking a kind of core of identity. And of course, if we go back to the mirror, we can connect the mirror with Jeffrey Pynchon, who himself has this narcissistic gaze on history, who just wants to make history stop and maintain what he wants history to be like. He wants the Pynchon line to persist forever. He wants what is past to live on into the present and into the future. So these are three of many interesting images in the novel. The chickens would be another place to look for an interesting image. Of course, we have the imagery of Alice's posies and Alice's harpsichord, and we will talk also about mesmerism. But these three images, I think, help us get at in different ways of thinking about the relationship between stasis and motion, and the relationship between egocentrism and empathy, as well as a way of thinking about these three different characters. The symbols are not exhausted at all by what I've said, but I think this is a helpful way to move into the novel.